Not to be overly dramatic here, but I do think that these are like the death throes of a dying culture. um,
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April video essay here on the financial diet. It's me, your host, Chelsea Fagan, founder and CEO of The Financial Diet. And today, as you might have seen from the title and thumbnail, we are here to talk about Stanley Cups. No, not the prize you get when you are the best at hockey. Also, side note, as someone who, my dad's a hockey fan, I never really enjoyed hockey that much, but I feel like hockey's having a moment. Tate McRae, all of those really smutty books with the cartoon covers, the ongoing and unnecessary political issues we're having with Canada. I apologize. Hockey's having a moment. But no, we're not talking about that Stanley Cup. We are talking about this Stanley Cup. And yes, I'm creating this video, which, as you will soon see, has a lot more to do with sort of the broader cultural moment that we live in than just a Stanley Cup. But I am also doing it as a Stanley Cup owner, although I always like to specify that I got this for free because my husband got it as swag at a conference. But truth be told, I've never been so hydrated, and I would buy one if I didn't already have one. They're a great mug, and I love that when I wake up in the morning, my ice is still frozen in it, as someone who likes really cold water. We are here today to talk about how sort of everything now is Stanley Cups. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Stanley Cups are one of those products and cultural symbols that both typified and exacerbated a lot of ongoing cultural and consumer phenomena, which is just a fancy way of saying that we are in our Stanley Cup era as a culture. Because when it comes to cultural symbols that seemingly appeared out of nowhere and suddenly typify the era that it flourished in, few recent examples are more pertinent than the Stanley Cup. Arguably peaking in late 2023 to mid-2024, but still extremely prominent on places like social media or at any school pickup, the cup has become an unlikely symbol of so many current aspects of our cultural moment. And yes, if you're curious, even if I must admit, I do love mine. But before we can unpack everything that the Stanley Cup represents and how so much of our day-to-day life is influenced by the same cultural drivers that made them such an icon, we need to look into the history and subsequent rise of the Stanley Cup itself. Interestingly, Stanley the brand has been around since 1913, so why has it completely taken off in the last few years? The product itself, of course, isn't that old. Quote, the Stanley Quencher model wasn't an instant hit when it was first released by the 111-year-old brand in 2016. It was only after the product was featured on the Buy Guide in 2017 that sales began to climb. Then the tumbler really blew up on TikTok, where the Stanley tumbler hashtag has racked up over 1 billion views. Hype from creators and influencers continue to drive up sales, and in both 2022 and 2023, they were one of Gen Z's most coveted Christmas gifts. And if we're going to unpack the ways in which the Stanley Cup has represented so many other aspects of our consumer moment, it's worth noting that part of what made Stanley so successful and enduring as a company in the first place, even if it wasn't as popular as it now is because these are products that are meant to be one and done, i.e. you buy one of them, it lasts you for life, and you never need to buy it or fix it again. Which may feel obvious, who would want to buy a water bottle that you're going to have to replace very soon? But look around your home, look in your closet, look in your kitchen. Chances are that the majority of items you now own are not meant to be that way. And when it comes to companies that do offer those lifetime guarantees, or similar programs like the ones found at REI or at LL Bean, it's actually become pretty rare, especially for these low to mid-market consumer products. We don't buy things anymore with the intention of them lasting forever, and what's interesting about the Stanley Cup was that despite being an item that was designed to only ever need to be bought once in your entire life, it became a cultural phenomenon of not only people buying way more than one, but people buying a bunch of unnecessary stuff to add onto it that, you guessed it, is made of cheap plastic that needs to be repaired or replaced, likely within a year. Quote, Stanley's website claims that its products never need to be thrown away or replaced, and that its reusable water bottles are built for life. There was even a viral TikTok posted in November in which a woman's Stanley tumbler is shown as having outlasted a car explosion fully intact and still full of ice.
Still has ice in it.
But with not just our overall craze around consumption, but specifically around water consumption, I say as I have my Stanley Cup near my feet and my producer just took a swig from her water bottle, the Built for Life idea is now pretty moot. Quote, in the past, consumers signaled their love of hydration and the environment with water bottles from brands like Nalgene, Swell, Hydro Flask, and Yeti. But none of Stanley's predecessors inspired a frenzy on a scale so large that it threatens to symbolize the very kind of environmentally harmful consumption that reusable containers are supposed to end. end. And in 2009, the New York Times reported that when compared to plastic, the production of stainless steel bottles requires 7 times the amount of fossil fuels, emits 14 times more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and requires hundreds of times more metal resources.
And one thing that undoubtedly led to the rise of the Stanley Cup at the rate and intensity it rose was its origins and appeal that carried a distinct tinge, a Mormon tinge. According to one Axios article, quote, starting in 2017, they were featured on The Buy Guide, a popular Utah-based shopping blog and Instagram account launched by 3 former BYU students. In the past couple of years, the mugs became a signature momfluencer accessory, one that paired nicely with Utah's dirty soda craze. And for this topic, I knew that there was one person I absolutely had to talk to, Amanda Mull.
My name is Amanda Mull. I'm a senior reporter at Bloomberg Businessweek, and I write the Buying Power column, which is about consumer culture. It's interesting how the Stanley in particular has sort of like gone on this like sort of cycle of awareness, because it was popularized first by sort of this group of Mormon moms in Utah. So it started out with like a pretty like sort of conservative traditional valence to it. Like it was this group of sort of like wealthy white Mormons who first sort of like plucked the Stanley Cup from obscurity and recommended it to their friends. And it used to be that trends were all sort of like top down or bottom up, that like either like a gatekeeper or tastemaker at the top of the sort of like cultural hierarchy would notice something and it would filter down. The cerulean sweater speech in The Devil Wears Prada is like the thing that I always think about, because for a long time, like that is how a lot of cultural trends worked. The sort of alternate configuration of that you got at the time was like that people in counterculture, so often young people of color, would be doing something and then gatekeepers would notice it and then like sort of make it expensive and then it would filter back down. The people who are sort of at the bottom of that cultural hierarchy do tend to be sort of like a middle-aged white conservative middle American person, who are not sort of plugged into the creation of cultural signifiers that young coastal people, by which I mean also sort of like more progressive, more open-minded, maybe more likely to be, engaged in creative pursuits, tend to be engaged in. But the internet has sort of jumbled that up a little bit. On the internet in particular, on social media, the phenomenon of Mormon influencers is sort of fascinating to me, because Mormon influencers are very, very good at selling products. And because the internet sort of jumbled how these messages move through society, you do have sort of this way that groups of people who are dedicated to getting their views out to the general public, that their preferences and consumer trophies and things like that do filter through in a way that like didn't really exist 20 years ago. So the Stanley Cup, I think, is an interesting symbol of how the trend cycle has been sort of turned on its head. But it's interesting because it started with Mormon moms in Utah, and then it sort of got picked up by mass media like the Today Show, Good Morning America, like People Magazine, like media that serves, the stay-at-home moms, the people who are sort of plugged into like very mass culture. And then it sort of like filtered up to like the New York Times wrote a trend story about it, like the New Yorker's writing about it, things like that. And I think that watching sort of legacy high-end media grapple with the fact that they are no longer sort of the fundamental gatekeepers of like how society is disseminated through culture is really, really interesting. And the sort of the arc of the Stanley Cup is a great way to sort of plot that.
And as we discussed in a video essay from last year, this would be far from the first time that Mormons have been patient zero of a consumer epidemic. In fact, one of the ways in which the Stanley Cup has been the perfect example of our current consumer culture is because of its Mormon connection. I'll throw to my guest from that video, the brilliant Francesca Ramsey, to speak more on that.
I think it's quite ironic that so many of them are Christian or Mormon, because I would just assume, I'm not a religious person, I'm a spiritual person, I would say. I would assume that it would go against their religious beliefs to participate so heavily in vanity and consumerism. I'm like, I don't think the Bible said anything about vlogging, but this doesn't feel like something, what would Jesus do? I don't think that he would be vlogging every aspect of his life and, dropping affiliate links and doing brand deals and using children as content. Like all of those things to me go against this idea of, being selfless and not being so focused on the aesthetic and putting material things on a pedestal and being so consumed with what other people think about you. But I will also add that historically, we know that a lot of religions are very hypocritical in, rules for thee and not for me. That is something that we've seen time and time again. Very often we see religious leaders that have been exposed for doing tawdry things that go against their religious beliefs. So that's not surprising.
Now, none of this is to say that Stanley is unique in its rapid ascension to cultural dominance after many decades of dormancy. See also brands like Carhartt, which, by the way, I was in Brooklyn recently. I am sick of seeing so many men with email jobs stealing the working class valor with their Carhartt outfits. But it is to say that when a product suddenly becomes a massive cultural phenomenon like the Stanley Cup did last year, there are usually many cultural factors at play. And in our current culture, although we've now started to move on to other products and trends, we can see just how much the Stanley Cup was a nexus of so many different aspects of our moment. Starting with Chapter 1, our era of faux abundance. You might have seen the recent unholy alliance between Klarna and DoorDash, wherein our late capitalist era has made it easier than ever to finance your $20 Chipotle order so that it ends up costing $70. And it is worth noting that while many of us were more than outraged/disgusted at this brand collab, and I'm one of those people, I think it is truly the symbol of a society in a bit of decay to need to be financing your morning coffee, Klarna just sort of makes explicit what a lot of us were already doing, which is financing things that should otherwise be basic household items, if not necessities. Quote, though much of the public reaction framed Klarna's integration into DoorDash as a novel instance of financing, that's not quite accurate. Consumers already finance food delivery, groceries, and other kinds of routine purchases using credit cards, paying off their balances at the end of the month rather than at the point of sale. Upgraded Points, a travel-focused website, found that over 20% of participants in its 2023 food delivery survey pay for their deliveries with a credit card that rewards these purchases. And unless the entire balance is paid off by the end of the month, the cardholder owes not just the remaining principal, but the interest as well. And in addition to being a glaringly obvious symbol that America is broke as hell, that we now have to have high interest in-app integration financing options for our lunch, I actually think it speaks to another and perhaps even more insidious cultural moment, which is, as I said, this era of faux abundance, where we can have a lot of really cheap things, as with fast fashion, or we can have access to daily luxuries like takeout food, yet never aspire to own a home.
Something that I hear a lot of people who work in like the consumer economy admit when I'm like talking to them on background or off the record or just whatever, is that like we don't really live in like a need-based consumer economy. If we were only satisfying the things that people need and like a reasonable set of wants on top of it, like we would, like the economy would sort of collapse, because we are in an economy that's sort of like structured by investors who want to see growth. We have sort of backed ourselves into a situation where you have to continue pumping consumers for additional purchases in order to satisfy the people who control the economy, essentially.
And when you look at what initially made the Stanley Cup so viral, because to be clear, a water bottle made of stainless steel with roughly the features and insulation capacities that it has was by no means new or exciting when it became viral, we see those same faux abundance factors at play. Think of this as a time of you can afford this and nothing else, where it's easier to normalize collecting things like Stanley Cups over things like designer goods, or even a few basic high-quality items because they're relatively inexpensive, around $40 to $50 a pop. Quote, after gaining some attention from an Instagram blog, the Quencher, Stanley's 40-ounce tumbler, became the it item on the app, with people showing off their collections of Stanley tumblers tumblers that take up entire walls in their home, and sharing affiliate links to accessories for their cups. If TikTok users didn't already have one before Christmas, they likely had it on their list, and each tumbler is around $50, making them expensive for a cup, but still attainable for most shoppers. And these kind of items that carry some social cachet but are still relatively affordable have become the defining items of the social media era, because they hit a sweet spot for our current broke yet wealth-obsessed culture. It's also worth noting that we are in a time where, as you might have seen on other articles or even this TikTok,
our luxuries is about 1 month's rent, where theirs was 3.5 years' rent.
the costs of necessities and luxuries have essentially totally reversed in the past 4 decades, where, for example, things like buying a home are vastly more expensive than they used to be, even adjusted for inflation, but getting a plane ticket to Europe has never been cheaper. The Stanley Cup represented many different types of aspiration, and we'll talk about more of them later in the video, but above all, they represented a kind of accessible aspiration, where you couldn't, for example, renovate your kitchen, but for example, you could open a cupboard and have 50 different colors of Stanley Cups to match each one of your outfits, as many people did. This phenomenon of faux abundance is also likely why, to go back to the earlier point about DoorDash and Klarna, food has become such a status symbol for millennials and especially for Gen Z, who eat out and order in far more than previous generations, because it's the kind of luxury that they can afford and which is also easy to share and therefore to show off, which brings us to our next chapter. Chapter 2. Cultural capital and hypervisibility. So one of the reasons why the Stanley Cup became as successful as it did, even again in a very crowded water bottle market where, like my husband and by extension myself, you're often getting this stuff given away for free as promotional swag, was because it was a very recognizable brand which, again, as we discussed in our last chapter, held a kind of accessible aspiration. And one of the key aspects to this very specific brand success is creating a sense of cultural capital based on in-group versus out-group. Are you getting the real one or are you using a knockoff? And as someone who, as a child, one of my, and listen, I'm not going to say this was a traumatic memory, but to a teenager it definitely felt traumatic, which was when I asked for Uggs for Christmas and begged and waited months ahead of time. I was writing that letter to, this is a side note, but my parents made us write letters to Santa even when I was like 18 because my sister's way younger than me. So they were like, don't ruin the ruse. You got to write your letter to Santa. We have nothing to do with the gifts. That goes straight to the North Pole. And I'm like, guys, I'm about to go to college. But suffice to say, I was writing my letter to Santa months in advance. I was waiting. I was excited. I wanted my Uggs. What did I open on Christmas Day except a pair of knockoff Uggs in a color that Uggs didn't even make? So you could see from across the school that I was not wearing the real deal. I absolutely broke down and cried. I absolutely hid them in the back of my closet and never wore them because I was so ashamed. Was that rational? No. Was that something I should have expected my parents to buy? No. But was it devastating to a child? Yes. And that was pre-social media, where I would actually have to go into the school building for people to see what I was wearing. And the Stanley, especially during the social media heyday, was one of the most visible instances of poor/middle class kids getting made fun of for having knockoffs. One TikTok went viral last year from a mom talking about her daughter getting made fun of for the Walmart tumbler she got for Christmas, telling her it wasn't a real Stanley.
She said 9, 10 of them all got Stanleys for Christmas, and they made sure to let her know that this is not a real Stanley, that this is fake, and it's not as cool.
And in order to prevent her daughter from getting bullied further, the mom bought her one from their local Ace Hardware, despite the fact that she didn't think her 9-year-old needed a name brand item. And anecdotally, many more instances of similar types of bullying over not having the right Stanley have started appearing all over the internet. As one interesting takeaway from a commenter on that Reddit thread puts it, trying to emulate classes above you is worse than just not partaking. Quote, "Mom of a teen and tween here. It's better to not have the product than to buy a knockoff. Kids are ruthless with name brands. They'll call out knockoffs and call it Temu or great value. My daughter wasn't into Stanleys, so she took a Fiji plastic water bottle to school every day and just refilled it. No one gave her any crap because she wasn't even trying to be part of the Stanley crowd." And as I said, this is something I think every generation of kids has to deal with to some extent. But I think those of us who grew up before the social media age was as ubiquitous as it currently is don't quite understand how much worse things have gotten, especially when it comes to the comparison and consumerism game. Because while grown adults may be able to opt out more thoughtfully from some of these social media-driven consumerism trends, and we all still struggle with it, or at least most people do, kids and teenagers' brains are no match for the kind of pressure that social media creates around having the right things. And on the flip side, there can be some embracing of it, i.e.,
Here are all of my current favorite dupes.
It's been a minute since we've done dupes at Target and I have so many good ones.
This is part 3 of the best dupes. I always say I'm a dupe queen. If there's a dupe going, I'm on the dupe. So let's get into the dupes.
But even the term dupe itself is often used in a derogatory way to shame not just the product, but the person who's choosing to buy it.
School-age kids, like, you know, when you're, say, like 10 through 18, through the end of high school, basically. This is a time when people are trying to figure out how to tell other people about themselves and what the things they buy or do or wear or whatever, like, are saying about them to other people. So you get this sort of like laboratory in which kids are working out how to socially signal about their parents' economic class, about their position within the social hierarchy of school. And things like a Stanley Cup are like very, very useful for that because they are like relatively affordable. Like they're more than like what a water bottle should perhaps like objectively cost. Because if you just need to hold water with a seal, like that is not like a particularly expensive product to make. But they provide a ability to talk to other people about ourselves, about our economic station in life. But to do it at like a price point that a lot of people can get in on. So, you know, you might not convince, if you're 16, you might not convince your mom to buy you a Louis Vuitton bag or a Chanel bag. There's very, very few people who can potentially afford that. But, you know, being able to carry around, you know, a bright pink $45 water bottle at school, where you might lose it, where, you know, it might get left in a classroom, where it might get broken, you might drop it, whatever, is like sort of it is a small flex because it demonstrates that you know that this particular item has value. So you are sort of signaling your cultural fluency, and then also a little something about the economic station of your parents. And like what the parents are doing when they buy these things for themselves is like sort of similar.
And while it's usually kids and teenagers who are most ruthless, it's not like they make up the idea of these brand names and their value themselves. As the mom said in that TikTok, this starts at home. Think of all the trends that we've seen that are emulating the rich, like the old money aesthetic. They probably start with young people, but 9-year-olds aren't crafting aesthetics themselves. They internalize the messages circulating around them. And while the Stanley Cup isn't a class marker of the wealthy, because even though they're pricier than other water bottles, most Americans could probably afford one. However, because it's so often seen in the hands of aspirational influencers, it's become a marker of taste, which is often just another type of class marker. And thanks to the importance that we place on name brand and on-trend items, taste has become something you can buy. Do kids really care about the particular quality of Stanley's or the built-for-life manufacturing? Probably not. They just understand that this is the brand to get without thinking about it more deeply. And if a kid has to buy a name brand Stanley Cup in order to not get bullied, why wouldn't a parent fulfill that wish? However, kids understand that Stanley Cups have cultural capital, even if they can't say it in those exact words. Quote, cultural capital encompasses the values, knowledge, skills, and ideas esteemed within a group. Objectified cultural capital refers to material possessions that symbolize status, such as luxury cars or large mansions. So why does Gen Z specifically obsess over brands or types of water bottles? A study from psychology professor Jean Twenge at SDSU found that high school seniors today spend an hour less each day engaging in in-person social interactions compared to seniors in the 1980s. So social media has clearly affected Gen Z's perception of social status. And with most social media now essentially becoming glorified shopping platforms, with things like the TikTok shop or the in-app integrations on Instagram, this direct connection that we are feeding people between buy this thing and be this person has become essentially the defining way that we move through the online and the consumer world. We see an aspirational person holding or wearing or using or putting on or eating a specific thing, we want that thing. Because whether subconsciously or explicitly, we associate their aspiration with that thing. And don't even get me started on the amount of people who are monetizing it via everything being an undisclosed affiliate link.
Now, in case you missed it, which is possible given that our current news cycle moves at a basically minute-to-minute basis at this point, there is a bit of a current cultural and consumer obsession with the concept of American-made. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't totally new, and Amanda will speak to that in more detail, but it has been coming back into popularity lately quality, usually being used as a sort of economic/philosophical reasoning for these, let's just say, ill-advised at best tariff strategies. Now, I'll link to a video in the description where I go off at length about these tariffs, but I think it's fair to say that the idea of everything suddenly being made in America again is at best a flimsy excuse being used to push forward an otherwise pretty unpopular and destructive economic agenda, because let's be clear, it would be a logistical and economic nightmare to produce 100% of what Americans buy in this country. It would, for example, among other things, mean that essentially every consumer good you could think of would instantly cost far too much for the average American to actually afford it, but it's also literally impossible for many of the products that we're currently consuming. But regardless of whether or not it's possible, it is becoming popular, especially with a certain side of the electorate, and there is a growing preference for products which can claim to be American, even if this is only an aesthetic matter. Now, we can have an intense debate about which products should be pushed towards more American manufacturing, and even then it's debatable if 100% American end-to-end production would be possible. But at least for the concept of what makes a product American, it's interesting how certain products have retained the halo effect of seeming American, or at least seeming of a certain production quality, even if they no longer are. And you might have guessed it, Stanley is a good example of this. Because while Stanley is an American company and is headquartered here, and it did used to produce its products in the US, specifically in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, so shout out to my Real Housewives of New York fans, if you know, you know, it has long since offshored most of its production to China, while still somehow retaining some of its American-made luster. It also does take pains to say on its website that its products are ethically made in China. Very unclear as to what actual standards that refers to.
The history of the sort of idea of Buy American is very, very interesting. It dates back to the Boston Tea Party and the non-importation movement, ahead of the Revolutionary War. And you see it emerge over time in situations where it is essentially like the marketing campaign that goes along with economic nationalism and protectionism. So you see it emerge full force in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It is generally heralded in by titans of industry. So in the 1930s, it sort of gets astroturfed into public consciousness by William Randolph Hearst and celebrated by other sort of businessmen of similar stature during that era. Hearst owned tons and tons of newspapers, and also owned the companies that put newsreels in movie theaters. So he had a big chokehold on public messaging. And you see this occur a couple times in American history. It happens again in the 1980s. At that point, it was sort of astroturfed into public consciousness through a textile magnate from South Carolina who went on to become one of the co-founders of Heritage Foundation, late of Project 2025 fame. So it is this sort of isolationist, protectionist idea of our money should only enrich our people, that American workers and American industry is fundamentally different and separate and superior from anything overseas. And that if you are a right-thinking person who cares about your country, you will patronize these businesses. And we see that sort of coming up again at the end of his first term, declared himself the Buy American, Hire American president. And through the tariffs and this latest round of sort of extreme protectionism, you see it coming back up. Well, it's why don't you want to buy American products? Why don't you want your neighbors to have jobs? Why don't you want people to have, economic security and stability? And don't you care about your community? But the idea of buying American in 2025 is pretty nonsensical. It becomes more nonsensical over the course of the 20th century. But right now, I truly don't know what it would mean to buy an American product when we're talking about a lot of the consumer goods or the consumer purchases that people make on sort of a daily basis. Because you have a lot of companies, like you were saying, as with Stanley, that are headquartered in the US, but they don't manufacture in the US. And then you've got companies that are headquartered in the US and manufacture in the US, but import a lot of materials that we don't make domestically in order to do that manufacturing. And then you've got Honda is a good example of this. That's a Japanese company headquartered in Japan, but it does manufacture a lot of the cars that are sold in America. So it becomes very, very difficult to explain even what like buy American means in the era of like a global supply chain. Very few of the sort of like complex consumer goods that we think of when we think of shopping are going to be like purely American products. Like that, like such a thing to a pretty great extent like doesn't exist anymore.
But what happens when you're fed constant images of this thing you need to be cool? You get chapter 3.
Overconsumption and dropshipping core.
If there's one area in which the Stanley both exemplified and perpetuated the current consumer culture, it is with overconsumption core. We've talked about this briefly in other videos, but accessorizing your Stanley became an entire cottage industry, one that is still very much alive and well. And honestly, while many of the Pack My Stanley With Me videos seem like ironic rage bait because they're so over the top that it seems unbelievable that anyone would actually be replicating these routines in real life, they're actually completely emblematic of restock culture, which has basically become a staple of lifestyle influencing. But Google something like best Stanley Cup accessories and you'll come up with plenty of listicles in women's magazines telling you exactly which Stanley accessories to get. For example, quote, now with the rise in charms, straw covers, specialty ice cubes, and even Stanley-sized backpacks, there's no chicer way to stay hydrated, especially if you're participating in dry January or hitting a daily hydration goal as your New Year's resolution. But these accessories aren't just stylish, they're functional too. People love the idea of packing their Stanleys like purses, says Emily Leah, a US-based content creator whose videos packing her Stanley bottle with snacks, mini lip glosses, and more have gone viral. After her first video received more than 1 million views in an hour, quote, I started to realize this is brilliant, says Emily. You can use it to carry everything you need while you're traveling or just running errands. And even though some of these products may seem like a joke, if you go on to places like Amazon where most people are buying them, you can see that they are extremely effing popular. Still to this day consistently in some of the top products of their categories.
And part of what is driving our current moment of ultra hyper consumption, wherein every product that becomes popular suddenly has 10,000 crappier products built on top of it, is an underlying business model that has exploded in recent years and which, you guessed it, the Stanley Cup was a perfect example of, and that is drop shipping.
Not to be overly dramatic here, but I do think that these are like the death throes of a dying culture. The sort of like we have run out of things to consume that serve like a straightforward purpose for us, and then so we end up with things to consume that are sort of additive to like actual purpose, and the sort of like marketplace structure of online retailers, I think is sort of like important to consumption overall in a way that is like under examined. First eBay and then really Amazon are the people who sort of like pioneered this. Like Amazon, most of what they sell is not sold by Amazon. Like there is you as a seller, if you have like some sort of widget that you want to sell, you set up your storefront, you list your own products, you send your inventory to Amazon, they deliver it. You pay about 50% of your purchase price in fees to Amazon for access to their audience, essentially. And that enables a lot of sort of like add-on products. And I think that what you saw with like the sort of Stanley Cup packing and Stanley Cup decorating is like a function of that. A lot of the Stanley Cup like baubles and add-ons come from Etsy. You end up with a lot of people who are looking for like a cheap, inexpensive, lightweight, easy to ship product that they can buy in bulk and then flip. So a lot of people who list these things, they end up ordering them from like Alibaba, from Temu, where you can order things directly from the people who manufactured them in large quantities, or you can like negotiate. It's very, very easy for just a random person on the internet to access like manufacturing capacity in a way that like did not exist 20 years ago. So you have all of these people who are sort of like opportunists, essentially. It's a very like hustle economy thing. You buy a bunch of inventory of this and you ship it yourself, or if it's something that's like that the math works out, you drop ship it individually. there's a lot of indicators that are sort of like circumstantial evidence that people like just really don't have any faith in like a traditional way to make a living in the US. And like asset prices outpace, wage growth. Like I get why people don't have like a ton of faith in that. So you get a lot of people who are looking for who are looking for a way to flip something and make a buck, who are trying to find ways where they can sort of exist outside of the sort of traditional labor economy, and finding like little baubles that you can sell that like sort of let you glom on to an existing trend or an existing phenomenon is like a way that a lot of people do that.
But it's worth noting that while Stanleys have become some of the most visible culprits of overconsumption culture, they are far and away not the only culprit. And typically the social media driven overconsumption manifests in two ways. You have the hoarding of the item itself, as with the massive collection of Stanleys, but also the massive collection of perfume, of makeup, of soap, of clothes, of shoes, of literally any other consumer item that we don't need to be buying dozens and dozens of, all of which are immensely popular on social media. But then on top of collecting the item itself, which I think is an extremely dubious term when we're not talking about actual collector items, and even then, why do you need so many stamps? There's also the idea of accessorizing your items to death. Even just 10 years ago, the idea of accessorizing a water bottle would have been essentially unthinkable. But now we accessorize everything. Our phones, our desks, our nightstands, our pillows, even our faces when we sleep. They even accessorize their dog poop bag carriers. And while some of the overconsumption is clearly driven by, well, A, getting a lot of views on social media because people, for some baffling reason, really like this stuff, and also just filling the empty void in your heart with endless pastel-colored products, valid. There's also often an undertone of optimization, especially when it comes to accessorizing. Are you getting the most out of something? Are you doing it in the best way? And the reason the Stanley Cup, I think, became such a cultural phenomenon is because no matter how over the top it was, no matter how wasteful, no matter how unnecessary or aesthetically ridiculous, there was still always that undertone of health, which, like skincare in our current culture, always confers a kind of sense of moral goodness. You can justify using all of these products on a daily basis or waking up with your face looking like this if you're doing it in the name of skincare. Makeup is a little more complicated, but the Stanley Cup, particularly when holding its original intended water, is able to keep that moral cleanliness because it's about Chapter 4, I've never been more hydrated. As it pertains to the Stanley, this downward spiral of overconsumption also provides a great illustration of the insidiousness of wellness culture, especially as it exists today. Starting with something objectively good for you, being hydrated, but then rebranding it into something that you have to do the right way, which obviously requires ongoing purchases to keep up with.
The concept of of luxury hydration, of the luxury water bottle has been around for quite a while. It predates Stanley. When I was at The Atlantic, I wrote an article about the phenomenon in 2019. And the market has only grown since then. So what you see with water bottles and a whole host of other types of goods, I think the athleisure trend is in part like indicative of this, that like having these sort of like high-end workout clothes, having the latest like Hoka sneakers or On running shoes or whatever is sort of indicative of this larger trend of the trappings of health and being able to sort of like leisurely take care of your body and yourself as this sort of like vehicle for luxury signaling. And the Stanleys are an entry and like a particularly successful entry in the pantheon of goods designed to do that. But they are part of a much larger ecosystem around which we market and brand and sell health as a luxury lifestyle that you buy your way into.
And I could rant about this for days, but I just want to say two quick things on the entire sort of like hydration / wellness culture that we've been living in for what feels like years now. One, we actually don't need to be drinking as much water as people are telling us to on social media. And lest we forget, we actually do get a lot of water through the food we eat. So obviously make sure that you are getting an appropriate amount of water based on your needs, your habits, your exercise, where you live, all of that stuff. But this feeling that if you are not constantly drinking water, that you are somehow being unhealthy is literally not true. That being said, I've been talking for an hour straight, so I'm parched. But on top of it, even if you did need to stay as hydrated as these influencers are telling you you do, like the mom whose daughter is just refilling a plastic bottle of Fiji water she got at the Dwayne Reed or whatever, you don't need to have the most optimal way of consuming something or making a healthy choice. That goes for everything from green juices to fancy exercise equipment to the right workout clothing to the over-the-top skincare routines that usually do nothing and can also hurt your skin. The skin barrier is real. Stop stripping it every day. We talked earlier about the cultural capital that having the brand Stanley carried. And it's ironic that it still carried the cultural capital, which likely came from the fact that it's originally from a high quality, built to last a lifetime brand when people are clearly no longer treating the product that way. But the cultural capital of the product itself is just one half of the puzzle. And again, with the rise of social media and the hyper visibility of how we're consuming things, the other half is what the product says about you. And what does carrying around a Stanley Cup say about you? Generally speaking, you're healthy, you're focused on wellness, maybe you're on a weight loss journey or a fitness journey. You're taking care of yourself. You're the kind of person who's very hydrated. So when you combine both the brand value and the value of what the product is saying about you as a person, and you sprinkle on all of the beautiful, aspirational, and low BMI influencers who were showing off their Stanley in every workout video, it's a pretty lethal combination. But again, not something just limited to these stainless steel cups. And what I've always found particularly fascinating about the Stanley Cup moment and what it says about our culture was how much this social media driven need to be performing wellness and performing making good choices usually results in another kind of in-group, out-group, not around the brand necessarily, but in how you go about those choices. In case you missed it, during the height of the Stanley obsession, there was also a micro phenomenon along with it of people making flavored waters, which became their own source of massive debate.
Hey guys, come make another water recipe with me.
Let's make my water of the day.
So our syrup today is cotton candy. I'm gonna do 3 pumps of that.
I used to never drink water until I started adding these packets, and people are like, oh, if you're adding those packets, it's not water anymore, blah, blah, blah. It still counts towards your water intake, and if I'm drinking more water because of it, it's better than not drinking any water at all.
Now, there are a lot of reasons why the water wars became such a thing on social media, and I do think a huge part of why it became so polarizing was because it became especially popular amongst creators who had undergone bariatric surgery, which many who are very plugged into the wellness, fitness / let's be very honest, body conscious space online look at negatively. Whether you drank your water pure or you were putting sugar-free additives into it to make it taste better became a hot topic of debate. These videos were both immensely popular and also immensely hated. You basically can't go to any one of the viral water talk videos without an ensuing 1,000+ long comment section of people fighting over whether it was good that they were staying hydrated or a sign of America's decline because we can't even drink water without it tasting like sour blue raspberry. From one article, quote, "My stomach aches even thinking about this. Let us mentally shoot Pepto as we plunge into what feels like the year 1987. All over #WaterTalk, a corner of TikTok haunted by the hydration enthusiasts, creators are turning enormous tumblers of H2O into flavors like peach ring, cotton candy watermelon, and strawberry shortcake. Just about all of these recipes call for sugar-free powders and syrups from brands like Sunkist, Nerds, and Gatorade. Of course, the commenters are mad as hell, insisting that the neon-hued, doctored-up drinks are no longer even water. Meanwhile, many of the creators say they simply would not be able to hit their daily hydration goals without a little powdered Sonic ocean water. So sue me, none of this discourse matters. According to eaters Amy McCarthy and me, the inherent diet culture rhetoric here is one big aspartame-laced red flag. It's giving leg warmers and fat-burning workouts. It's giving low-calorie meal plans. It's giving just add a squeeze of lime, ? Distressing for the water girlies. This tug of war between performing wellness and actually being well has become one of the defining aspects of being on social media, especially, I hate to say it, as a woman. We are constantly expected to be making good choices out loud, and carrying around a water bottle is a way of subtly conveying that. It's a status symbol in its own way. But the water wars are also a good reminder that it's not enough just to have the product. It also depends how you use it. Your individual results may vary, which brings us to Chapter 5, Being an Individual in the Time of Homogeny. In my mind, one of the most compelling aspects of the rise of the Stanley Cup, something that we see in countless products that go ultra viral or sell out in places like the TikTok shop now, is striking the perfect balance between being able to distinguish yourself through your consumer choices and yet still fitting in with the broader cultural trend. There has been massive discourse lately about the flattening effect of influencer culture.
Influencer culture perpetuates homogenization and conformity, which then makes us easier to control.
There's also been much debate around which type of influencers you're following, what they're teaching you, not just about them, but about yourself. But one of the key things that took the Stanley Cup in particular from being just a pretty well-selling product to being the absolute cultural juggernaut that it was that ability to accessorize and customize the product that we mentioned in an earlier chapter. The accessorizing, which we should note was not even led by the company itself, gave consumers that perfect social media balance between participating in a trend and yet still expressing themselves in a limited, narrow way. It's sort of reminiscent of a previous era, that of the subscription boxes, which was usually just a way to get you to buy a bunch more crap under the guise of personalization. And it's one thing that our current consumerism does really well: convince us that buying certain things is going to make us into the best, most actualized version of ourselves. And even when people were building out their collection of these products, or when we were mindlessly watching those videos at home, it was sort of a mini masterclass in how brands are quickly learning to the way that we react to items online and giving us endless options to participate in slightly different, but usually still at the end of the day the same ways. The Stanley brand's no dummy, and they've learned the power of things like limited edition releases and how an abundance of colorways encourages consumers to buy this type of item by multiples, even though their own brand stresses that one should be enough. Quote, "The brand now regularly brings out quenchers in new color ranges for collectors to snap up. Most recently, a video of women swarming around a display of pink and red Galentine's collection Stanley Cups released at Target on New Year's Eve went viral and has since been viewed over 24 million times. With such fervent demand, it's no surprise that the brand's revenue has skyrocketed from $70 million in 2019 to $750 million in 2023. And growing a collection of these cups makes sense when you consider that humans are drawn to cultivating a sense of completion. Quote, Casey Lewis is a youth consumer trend analyst who writes the newsletter After School, and she agrees that the impetus driving consumers to buy Stanleys is for the most part surprisingly straightforward. Buying stuff feels good, it's a dopamine hit, but collecting anything from Stanley tumblers to Vera Bradley purses to Snoopy plushies also gives people a sense of purpose and accomplishment. And part of what these releases and drops and colorways also do is enable people to feel like they are building a collection, something that would ideally involve hunting in a lot of different spaces for special, unique things that you accumulate over time. Building collections, which is something that so many brands are now doing and using social media to sell more effectively, is at its core a very human impulse, and one that speaks to our desire to represent our taste in a more individual and curated way. But this cheapened version of it, where brand after brand is giving us a false sense of having built that collection, is actually, surprise, not making us happier. And it's also, it should be noted, hugely bad for the environment, which again, given the origins of the product and its intended purpose, particularly ironic.
There is this sort of paradox in that, we as a culture sort of valorize the idea that something is durable enough to last forever. That is a sign of quality. That is a sign of luxury at this point. But you can't run a very good business by the parameters that our economic system sets for a good business by selling things that people never need to buy again. So you have this sort of paradox where you have the social value of owning things that are meant to last a long time, in that it marks you as a person who values quality, who is willing to spend more in order to get something with like better characteristics. It becomes a status symbol rather than something that has material meaning in your life. The markers of having something durable and having something well made have more social value than they have like material value in our consumer economy.
Collecting a ton of Stanleys, which according to the website are 90% recycled, negates any of the positive impact that could be argued from utilizing a reusable water bottle rather than a disposable plastic. They might be mostly recycled materials, but if everyone is buying dozens of them and eventually throws them away, sending them to landfills, is that really any more sustainable? It looks like we're coming out the other side of the particular Stanley heyday phenomenon. And if so, I'm glad, because I really can't see any more videos of people putting those weird little backpacks onto their water bottles. But I think it's worth noting that the things that made the Stanley tumbler such a cultural phenomenon, made them so ubiquitous, so must-have, on the hands of everyone from celebrities to influencers to the person sitting next to you in the cubicle, are not limited to those water bottles. And while some of these factors, like cultural capital, have been in play basically since humans have been in play, we need to remind ourselves that the scale at which these things are happening, at which these products become ultra-viral, take over our lives, and become ultra-unhealthy sources of consumerism, and let's be honest, a borderline hoarding obsession with collecting, is not normal, and is heavily driven by our social media consumer landscape. Yes, things like Beanie Babies had a similar level of scale and cultural impact, but we have like 10 Beanie Baby phenomena a year now on social media. Nearly every day there is a new product in every category that everyone must have, that's selling out like crazy, that all of the teenagers are obsessed with, and it's not a coincidence that most of those same products can be purchased within the apps they become viral on. This isn't to say the product isn't good. I obviously think it is. I love mine. But it's important to ask ourselves with each new must-have item, is this something that's going to actually add value to my life? Or have I just been hoodwinked yet again by the teens on social media? We'll see you next month on our all-new video essay. Bye.